Hey everybody, I'm Rick Beato. In today's episode, I sit down with enigmatic Steely Dan guitarist and founding member Denny Dias. Out of everyone that's played on Steely Dan records, he's pretty much the only one that I knew virtually nothing about. I was excited to ask him about his iconic solos like the electric sitar one on Do It Again, or the bebop-inspired solo on Bodhisattva, or his really cool solos on Green Earrings, or this one that's on Asia. Denny's work in these tracks really defines Steely Dan's guitar sound from the outset. Here's my interview. Denny, welcome.
Glad to be here.
I read somewhere that you were the one that initially put the ad in, I guess, the Village Voice, looking for a band that Donald Fagen and Walter Becker answered. Is that true?
Sort of. I had a band in Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
There were four of us. The bass player quit. I thought, we should have a piano too. So I suggested we get a piano player and a bass player. And we had a manager at the time, a guy named Bruce Rothstein, and he put the ad in the paper.
Okay.
So it was his wording. But we got a response, and I must have talked with Walter on the phone for almost an hour before I met them. And then they didn't have a car.
Okay.
So I picked them both up in Brooklyn.
Okay.
At Donald's apartment, and drove them back to my house in Hicksville.
Okay.
And we set up, and I remember Walter started walking the bass. And, well, we were still setting up, and then as everyone got set up, they would join in, and we must have played for 2-3 hours without stopping.
Wow. Did they have any songs at the time?
Well, I'm sure they did, but, we didn't hear any at that time.
Were you guys just doing covers at first?
Yeah, we were playing clubs on Long Island, and you had to play familiar songs.
Yeah. And what kind of songs would you guys play?
Mostly the R&B, Sam and Dave, and Knock on Wood, some Temptation stuff.
Did you consider yourself a jazz guitar player or a rock guitar player at the time?
Well, I studied jazz guitar.
Mm-hmm.
I liked playing rock and roll because you got to play with people, for people your own age. Nobody liked jazz.
Even then, right?
Yeah. So, I was playing jazz guitar in a rock and roll band, and that's all I've ever done.
And this would have been what year? Late 60s, early,
Yeah, in the 60s, 67, 8, 9.
So how did Steely Dan actually form, and when did you guys first start recording songs?
After that day that we met, Donald and Walter were playing backup for Jay and the Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And they would do an occasional recording session because, they would always try to find some new artists and make some new songs. And they would be writing songs for these odd people that were trying to make records. And now and then they'd call me for a session. And, that's all we were doing until one day they called me and said they got somebody who's offering them a record deal and they got to go to California. And would I like to go? And I says, well, am I going to be able to live out there? He says, well, you'll have a salary and you could probably get an apartment. I said, okay, I'm in.
And that was it.
Yeah, I drove across the country with some other guy who would have otherwise taken an airplane, and he did most of the driving.
And then what happened next?
Well, we did some rehearsals, because they had a couple of other guys in mind for the band, including Baxter and Hodder. And, Donald did not want to sing.
Okay.
So he wanted to get a lead singer. Baxter knew somebody, David Palmer,
mm-hmm.
who he invited to come join us, and it took him a while to get to California. And we started recording before he got here, but then when he did get here, he was singing the songs live that Donald sang on the record. And after a couple of records, it was obvious that Donald was the voice of the band.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the first things that you guys recorded? What songs would they have been?
Well, they had actually made a record before I even got here.
Okay.
A tune called Dallas. And it was released as a single. I don't know if you've heard it, but it predated the first Steely Dan record.
Everyone I know, I'm saying goodbye, bye, bye, Dallas. I can't stay, should have been at the palace. Missed a day, bye, bye, Dallas. Got to go. And I remember when they told me so.
Jimmy Hodder, the drummer, he sang that song. And he sang some songs on the first record, too.
How come Donald, did you not like the sound of his voice? Why didn't he want to sing?
Well, he didn't have the endurance to carry a whole show.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he knew that he would get out of breath quickly. You know, I mean, you could do it in the studio because you'd do like a verse at a time and take a minute and catch your breath. You know, he just didn't have the lungs of a lead singer, and he didn't want to do it. He didn't like doing it. He didn't want to be the front man, you know, and he didn't do like what Mick Jagger does. Or
Right, yes.
You know, he had the personality that, you know, that said what he wanted to say in the tunes that he wrote. You know, nobody else could quite do that.
I'd like to take a second to talk to you about this channel. Of the people that regularly watch my channel, 58% are actually not subscribed. So I encourage you to hit the subscribe button now. This will help me to get even more of my dream guests and continue to grow my channel. Thank you. The songs on Can't Buy a Thrill, were all those songs recorded at the same time, or was the album kind of put together over the course of a
It was a constant effort. We went in the studio every day.
Okay.
And worked until it was done.
I'm trying to think, there's a few songs that Donald did not sing on the record. Maybe, is it Midnight Cruiser? Just only a couple songs that
And Jimmy Hodder sang it, yeah.
Yeah, that Donald does not sing on. And was that a, once again, a conscious choice? I mean, Donald obviously could have sung these tunes in the studio.
Yeah, I mean, if he could, he would have had somebody else sing all the songs.
Okay. So did he see himself more as a writer then and a keyboard player?
Yeah, when I first met them, they thought that they could write songs of various types and have like a number of groups all recording their songs.
Yeah, like songwriters.
Songwriters, yeah.
So you have one of the most famous solos, really, of any of the Steely Dan records, which is the Do It Again solo that you play on electric sitar. Tell me about the recording of that song and how that solo came about.
You know, I get more questions about the electric sitar than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I've only seen it that once, and just for about 2-3 hours.
Was it a rental?
It was a rental.
Yep.
It was a piece of crap.
Yeah.
Basically a Dan Electro guitar with a special bridge that made it buzz and sound like a sitar.
Yeah.
We rented it because Donald thought he wanted to have like a droning sitar, you know, like that Beatles song with the droning sitar in it.
Tomorrow Never Knows.
It wouldn't drone. You need a real sitar and somebody that knows how to play one.
Yeah.
But when I picked the thing up and they started running the track, I just started improvising. And then somebody said, well, why don't we just do the solo with the sitar? I was, okay. You know, and we went through it a few times and that was it.
I want to play it. So that's just one pass on that.
Yeah, not the first take, but maybe the third take.
And when you finished it, did they say, "Oh, that's great"?
Well, the expression in the studio was, "I'll buy it."
Okay, and you felt good about it.
Yeah, I mean, if they were happy with it.
What did the other takes sound like?
A little, stumbling here and there.
Uh-huh.
I don't really remember.
Denny, that is such an amazingly great solo that to have the flow of that all the way through really blows my mind. First of all, you play certain types of lines that I don't hear anyone play, and it must be something about just the way that you put phrases together.
Well, when other guys are practicing blues licks, I'm playing scales and arpeggios.
You're thinking more of this as playing, just modal playing with some blues notes in it, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, even listening to it, I hear, the higher harmonies, the 6th and 9th, 13th. And, I'm just thinking of extending the chords and playing more than the 3 notes that are in the chord.
When you would do solos like this, would they be done in the control room with the amp out the other room typically?
Yeah, and you run the wire out to the amplifier.
Now, one of the interesting things is that this studio, maybe not this particular one because it wasn't built yet, it was done here, right? At the Village Recorder?
Studio A.
Studio A. So when you were going to meet me here today, you knew exactly where to go, right?
Yeah.
You've been here a million times, I bet.
Yeah, but not for 40 years.
Right. Was this one of the main places to go to record?
I don't know.
They just said, this is where we're going to be. This is where the session is.
Yeah, I mean, I think Walter spent more time thinking about the sound and the equipment that produced it and what studio made good records. Because he would look at the records that he liked the sound of, and he saw where they were recorded, because it usually said so on the back. And they picked this place.
What was your guitar rig at the time, back then in the early 70s?
At the time...
Did you play a Telecaster?
There was one before that. I had a Dan Armstrong guitar.
Okay.
The clear plastic guitar with the interchangeable pickup.
Yeah.
And it was funny because Walter had Dan Armstrong bass.
Okay. And what kind of amp did you play through? Like a Fender Deluxe or something like everybody did back then?
I don't remember what amp I had. I know that one of the first amps I bought was a Marshall.
Okay.
Because I was trying to sound more like a rock and roll guitar player and less like a jazz guitar player. But before that, I don't know. I mean, in the past, like on Long Island, I had a Custom, I had a Fender. I remember at one point we had a deal with Custom. They actually gave us some amplifiers, and we were using them for a while. There was one tour when we used them, and Walter got really mad at my amp one time on stage, and he just kicked it over. I hadn't even thought about that in years.
When you guys were recording in the studios back then, how involved would you be as far as like getting your own tones? You get your tone and then they just come up and mic the amps, typically?
Yeah, pretty much. It needed approval.
Okay.
So sometimes it was difficult to find a tone because, the way I play, it doesn't sound like when somebody else picks up the same guitar with the same amp and the same settings, and it has a whole different sound with other fingers.
When Do It Again was on the radio, what did you think about that?
Well, somebody said they're playing us on the radio, and I says, yeah, what song? They said, Do It Again. I said, oh, really? I had no idea. Nobody thought that would be a single.
That must have been quite a shock.
Yeah, and when it made it into the top 10, it was like, this is not bad at all.
Especially a song that has a really long guitar solo in it. I mean, that's a long guitar solo, sitar solo.
Yeah, I was a little disappointed when they cut it down for the single. But, it was really too long for a single.
Well, I only remember it in its full length from when I was a kid. On the radio, they would play the full length, at least where I lived.
Yeah, you never heard the cut version?
I've heard the cut version before.
Yeah, they cut the guitar solo short and completely eliminated the organ solo.
Yeah. Is that Donald playing the organ solo on that?
Yeah, it's actually a synthesizer with an organ sound, but yeah.
It's one weird solo. It's cool. He's got
I
some
know.
really,
I liked his solo a lot.
yeah, it's really an unusual, like some really cool notes in it, and kind of a whoa.
Yeah, he takes advantage of the echo and the portamento.
When you play a solo like that, back then, when you're working on a record, how much scrutiny would there be of the of it? On this first record, probably not as much as later on.
Well, once it was done, they said, that's it, we'll buy it. It was just a question of a mix down, that's all.
And were you involved at all with that? Were you there when they mixed the stuff?
Yeah, I think it's written somewhere. They called me the Mixmaster General.
Okay.
Because I would just take control of the board. And Roger Nichols was a brilliant technician, but his taste in sound was not really to most of our likings.
Okay.
And I was a hi-fi buff.
Okay.
And so was Walter, but I really did a lot of the the panning and the EQ and stuff like that.
Wow.
Until they could afford to hire somebody that really knew what they were doing.
So on the first record, did you do a lot of the mixing?
Yeah.
Even on the songs that you were not necessarily involved? Were you pretty much played on all the songs on the records?
Not all, but most of them, yeah. There's like a part or two and like a background part.
So would you be there for most of the tracking of the record then?
Oh, I was there every day.
Wow. Like on songs like Reelin' in the Years, you and Skunk would play the single line parts, and Elliot Randall did the solo.
When we wanted the guitars to blend perfectly in harmony,
Yep.
had the same guy do both parts.
Got it.
That way the inflection would be the same.
Let me pull up Reelin' in the Years here.
That you think is gonna last. Well, you wouldn't even know a diamond if you held it in your hand. The things you think are precious, I can't understand. Are you reeling in the years, stowing away the time? Are you gathering up the tears? Have you had enough of mine? So, you would have mixed that then?
It was a group effort. Mm-hmm. But I did have my hands on the board a lot.
The blend of all the vocals on that song is incredibly good. I mean, it's really, they're so perfectly blended.
Well, there's limiters involved. Mm-hmm. And Roger Nichols had his formula. He told me about it once. He records at one ratio of compression and plays back at a different rate of compression. I think he used UA limiters.
Do you know what kind of console's in Studio A here?
I'm sure it's different than it was then. And there was no automation at all, which is why it took 5 people with both hands to make all the changes from the verse to the chorus.
Would you guys ever mix sections and then edit the 2-track together?
We might have a couple of times, but most of the time, it was a performance. You get to the next section of the tune and everybody had to make certain moves. You had the marks on the board. This is where the verse is, and then bring it down to here and the guitar comes into the center for the solo and it moves back.
So somebody would be controlling the pan and doing all that?
Yeah, well, all by hand.
What did you think when automation finally happened? You must have been, thank God, right?
Yeah, except that our experience with automation was not what other people had. Because for us, we'd get it just right, and we'd come back the next time, and everything was screwed up.
Did you ever think that this was going to turn into something, that people were going to be listening to this record Are these songs
Well, you
50
hope.
years later?
You hope, you try and you cast your seeds and see what sprouts.
What are some of the other songs off that first record that you enjoyed as songs?
I was always partial to Turn That Heartbeat Over Again, Fire in the Hole.
Yeah. Dirty Work or Midnight Cruiser, those songs, did you like? Or
Those were not my favorite.
okay. You like more of the maybe off the beaten track kind of songs?
Yeah, I once said to Walter, I said, how do you write a song with such intricate harmony that sounds like it belongs on the AM radio? Mm-hmm. He says, well, that's the beauty of it. The kids won't know that it's sophisticated. No.
So he was really aware of that then?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Walter was brilliant. He wasn't the musical talent that Donald Fagen was, but he sure knew how to get the production done. He spent a lot of time in investigating sound quality. And, I mean, he brought his own speakers into the studio. I mean, we recorded like the third and fourth records using magnaplaners. I don't know if you ever heard of them. But they're sort of like electrostatic speakers, but they're electromagnetic. And they're just these monolithic sheets, and they sounded like crystal clear. You could hear things on those that you couldn't hear on normal speakers.
And that was unusual for the time for people to do that.
Well, nobody did it. I mean, you go into a studio, they have state-of-the-art equipment. Why would you bring your own?
Because you can?
Yeah, I remember going over to Walter's house, and he says, check this out. And he played Diamond Girl on a pair of quad electrostats. I'd never heard anything like it. I mean, it sounded like transparent. Mm-hmm. The problem with them is that they don't go very loud, because if you turn them up too high, they blow up.
What did you used to listen to mixes on? Would you ever take stuff out of the studio and listen in your cars back then on cassette?
You try to listen as many places as you can. I mean, you've made records. You can't just listen on one set of speakers. You have to go see how does it sound on small speakers. Every studio I've seen has a pair of small speakers on the console, just so that you can see what's going to happen when there's no bottom end. And
I'm always curious to know what people did. When you take something out of the studio to listen to your car, you're putting on a cassette, changes the tone of it, so it's not really an exact representation of what it is that you're hearing off the half-inch here. And also, how much time do you leave a mix up while you're checking it out? Do you leave it up for a day? And come back the next day?
Oh, there were many times where we'd come back and, somebody would have a problem with a certain section. Like the vocal was getting buried in this spot here. And, at least on their speakers at their house.
Yeah.
And we'd try to get it where it sounded good no matter where you were.
Would you do things like vocal up a dB and things like that, where you do alternate mixes?
I don't think there's anything we didn't do.
Those guys were really wanted to cover all the bases.
It was more than that. They covered all the bases and the outfield and even the bleachers.
There's another famous solo that you play on Bodhisattva. Okay, so what kind of a sound is that? What are you playing through there? Is that a fuzz box?
No, I think it's a Marshall.
Okay.
A Telecaster with a humbucker, replacing.
You playing on the front pickup?
The pickup by the neck.
Okay.
I usually do. I don't like the thin sound of the bridge pickup.
Mm-hmm. Now is that
in fact, I think on that solo I was playing through 2 amps.
Okay.
And Walter kept adjusting the sound, the balance between the two, and it was recording on 1 track, but he engineered that sound.
Now was that one pass through?
No, there's like I think 3 sections to that.
Okay.
Made a mistake at one point, and then I remember Donald saying, "Why don't you play fourths?" And that's all I went doing. Those are fourths, and it continued there. And then I think there was one other place where we punched in.
When I hear that, I hear more of like a jazz player playing over, like a kind of like a weird blues, but it's but the way that you outline the chords, you outline them like a jazz musician would.
Well, yeah. Walter used to call it running the changes.
Yeah. So where did you learn to do that? Did you have lessons? You have a jazz guitar teacher?
Yeah, I studied with Billy Bauer.
Okay.
You've heard of him?
I've never heard of him, no.
He played with Woody Herman.
Okay.
Lenny Tristano.
Mm-hmm.
And for a while, he was the guitar player in the Tonight Show band. I think it was the Tonight Show. It might have been one of the other networks. But it was a network orchestra where he had a regular job. And he taught me a lot of what I know. But he was more than just a teacher. He was a philosopher.
Okay.
Because when I would talk about, technique and playing fast and, having a lot of facility and stuff, he'd pick up his guitar, which was a D'Angelico, and he played the opening theme from Clair de Lune.
Okay.
And he said, listen how simple that is. Gave me a whole new outlook on music that, you don't have to be fancy or fascinating. You just need to be emotional.
Did you guys learn standards? Did he teach you standards, jazz standards?
Yeah, we would play songs now and then. He mostly showed me how to get like the fundamentals of music theory, and to where like my fingers would know where to go, even when I wasn't thinking clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Scales and arpeggios, and that's where I learned to do that. And whenever I warm up, I'm still playing scales and arpeggios. There's one other thing he told me that I have to share. I was complaining to him about the quality of music, because it's mostly garbage. You hear it on the radio, and it's just nothing worth it. And he says, these things have been going on for thousands of years. Someday someone will come along and change everything. And I've always thought that Donald Fagen is that guy, because he expanded the scope of popular music like no one before him.
Why do you think that there's nobody that can write songs like Donald Fagen anymore?
Well, no one wants to.
I'm sure there's people that want to, but they can't.
Well, they wish they could, but, he spends a lot of time looking for harmonies that nobody ever thought to use before.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want to do something that he's heard somewhere else. And that's like a passion. You can't just instill that on somebody. Me and Walter and Gary Katz, more than anybody else, really appreciated the quality of the material we had to work with.
Can you tell me about tracking days? If you were on the tracking session, what that would be like?
Well, after the original band and the first record, I didn't really play on any of the tracks, especially once they started hiring all those mercenaries. Mm-hmm. They didn't want me gumming up the works. Because you bring in pros and they get it right the first time. And
but they still had you come back and play on songs.
Oh yeah, we'd do overdubs. Me and Baxter and Walter played a lot of the guitar solos. I don't know if you're aware, but those were interesting.
In what way?
Well, it would take 12 hours to get a 3-minute solo.
Because why, he wanted to experiment, or?
No, it's just that he understood the bass guitar very well. He was a great bass player. But when it came to the guitar, I don't know, he had some kind of mental block, you know. I mean, he would occasionally play some fabulous lick that was just, you know, perfect, and then it would fall apart. And so, talking about punching in, you know, the solo on Pretzel Logic, you know, that's him. It took all night long. And when I talked to him years later, he says it still takes him all night to get a full solo down.
When I interviewed Bernard Purdie, I talked about the song Green Earrings from Royal Scam, especially because he has this great hi-hat fill that happens right before your solo. This is one cool but weird song, the music to this.
Yeah, I did this all in one take too.
Okay. Now that's you playing that, right? Da-da-da, or are you talking about the solo you did in one take?
The solo.
Okay. Who's playing that part there, do you know?
Probably Larry Carlton.
Okay.
I sat next to him on the airplane going to New York to record this, the tracks.
Okay.
I remember the look in your eyes. I don't mind.
Are you doing a pinch harmonic there right at the very beginning of the solo?
Interesting you should mention that. I said I played this all at one time. That's not exactly true. The first take, I played that lick and my thumb touched the string and brought out the harmonics.
Yeah.
I didn't do that deliberately. I can't do it deliberately. But Donald really liked that. He said, gee, that was a shame because that was really cool. I says, well, I can play the lick and, you know, you can splice it together. And so that was from a different take.
Okay.
Just those few notes.
Right.
But I did play the lick.
Are you playing through a chorus or something like that?
Yeah, it's a Roland Jazz Chorus 120.
So you play through a Roland JC 120 amp?
Yeah.
With a chorus on?
With the chorus on, not just with the chorus on, but Roger Nichols heard what the amp is doing to make the chorus sound. And it's unique to that amp. It has two 12-inch speakers. And when you flip on the chorus, it puts the speakers out of phase.
Interesting.
Yeah, most people don't know that. So he put two microphones, one in front of each speaker, and they're separated, you know, in stereo, out of phase.
It's actually not like a normal chorusing then. It's really interesting.
No, it's enhanced chorus.
Yeah. Would anyone have cassettes of the solo section before they went in that you could kind of mess around beforehand?
I usually had a rough mix of the track.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember when we recorded that track, and you know, Donald was really happy with Bernard's performance.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and he looked at me, he says, what do you think? You think you can play a decent solo over that?
Yes, that's Bernard and Chuck. So this is a New York rhythm section.
Yeah, some people were flown in.
Why did they want to go there?
Well, they're from there. They remember the sounds of those studios. They liked them better in L.A. And
When you're coming to play on a session like this, you know the tune you're going to play on.
I would get a 1/4-inch tape, but a 2-track. I have a 2-track tape recorder. And
You have any of those tapes lying around, do you think?
oh yeah,
So basically just the rough mixes of the songs.
I have a lot of rough mixes of a lot of songs.
Be interesting to hear.
Well, you're welcome at my house.
I'm going to take you up on that, Denny. So you show up to do a solo like this. Basic tracks are done. You go into the control room, get your amp mic'd up. Once you're happy with the sound, what do you kind of mess around? It's like Roger works on the sounds or whoever's engineering gets it. Okay, so it's ready. Let's do it.
the Roland amp and plugged it in. Roger Nichols heard it. He put up the 2 microphones. I remember Walter going to the next room and saying to Donald, he says, Donald, you got to hear what Denny sounds like this year.
I'll play something else here.
That's the Telecaster before it was modified. David Palmer.
When you see this, does it feel like a long time ago?
Well, I don't remember having that much hair.
Let me get a little further in here. Okay, so how old were you there, Denny?
I don't know, what year was it?
1974?
74. Well, I was born in 46.
So, what was that, 28?
28, yeah.
28 years old.
You know that guitar was modified by Jeffrey Baxter?
Really?
Yeah, he used to do work on guitars at Valley Arts. He offered to do an upgrade for me, and he put a second humbucker on it, coil fader switches, and did a complete fret job.
He did fret jobs even? That's amazing. He told me he worked in a guitar as a guitar repairman. That was one of his first jobs.
Yeah.
And you still have the guitar?
Yeah.
With the same mods in it?
Yeah. He replaced the pick guard with a black pick guard.
So it's probably not long after this that he had it done?
Right, within a year or two after that.
Did he recommend it to you, or did you say, hey, can you do this for me?
He probably offered, because I wouldn't ask that.
Mm-hmm. Steely Dan was a band at first, right? I mean, you guys were part of the band.
Yeah.
When did they decide that they didn't want to do any more live shows and wanted to be a studio band?
They never wanted to have a band.
Okay.
They wanted to be able to hire great musicians, and as Donald Fagen used to say, he wanted to make perfect records.
Okay.
I always knew this, but he needed to have a band in order to get a record deal. So once they got into a position where they could afford to, stretch out and do things more like to their liking, they just dissolved the band.
And how'd you feel about that?
Well, I would have preferred a band myself.
Yeah.
But I could see their point, because the music was getting more and more difficult to play. It was like at the edge of our abilities. I thought that the world is a better place with this music being produced the way they wanted it done. So, I said, sure, whatever you want. They had my support.
Did you play in the Asia record?
Yeah, I played on the title song.
Do you remember what part of the song it is that you play on?
Just a solo.
Oh, I knew that.
Yeah.
Let me find it. Is that you on that part too?
No.
But that's you on the first part of that solo, right?
Yeah, I come back again.
On the next solo, yeah. You had the chart for that beforehand,
Oh, yeah.
and Larry was the one that did all the charts for this.
Did the charts, and I think he played that, some of those other parts. Walter played some of the guitar parts too.
By this time, this is 5 records into their career or something like that. Was it a different vibe when they were doing their recordings?
Well, yeah. I mean, they didn't care how much it cost.
Mm-hmm.
They had Bill Schnee. Bill Schnee could sit there and hold a conversation while he's manipulating the faders, eliminating noise by bringing the fader down in between hits of the snare drum,
Yeah. When you got asked to play on this record, would they call you up and say, hey, we have a couple songs we want you to play on. Can you be here next Tuesday? Or was it hey, we're in the studio right now. You want to come over and...
It was never right now. I always had a week to practice.
Okay. And would they send a chart and say, this is what you're going to be playing on?
A chart and a tape.
Chart and a tape. Once Steely Dan ended, what did you do?
Well, I wrote some songs, and I actually had a group of guys, 3 singers.
Mm-hmm.
I thought if I had 3 singers, they could each sing lead, and they harmonized well. And we cut some demos, which was fortunate because Jeff Porcaro had just built a recording studio,
mm-hmm.
and he needed somebody to make sure he got the kinks out and there was no bugs. So I had the thing for a week or 2, and I made some demos, which I didn't quite finish then. I did eventually manage to finish a few songs. I started about 6 or 7 songs. And managed to finish 3 of them. I've always said that if I could have finished those demos the day that I started them, I could have had my pick of record companies. But by the time they were done, the worm had turned, and we had the Sex Pistols and Culture Club, and it was a whole different world. Everybody that I knew that worked for a record company either got fired or demoted, or they were afraid to hire a new band that didn't look like the new wave,
mm-hmm.
So I found another career.
Which was?
Programming computers.
And you got into that when, in the late 70s, early 80s?
It was the early 80s. I was still trying to work on songs, and I heard about a guy who was writing an application that would let you play on a keyboard into a computer, and it would print out lead sheets.
Mm-hmm.
I said, gee, that sounds great. So I bought all the hardware I needed to do that, and ended up reading all the manuals and getting into the computers and programming languages. And Actually, I found a bug in a piece of software I was using, and I sent the proof of the bug to the people running that company, and they offered me a job.
Who was that company?
That was Nantucket. They don't exist anymore. They got bought up, but they did a product called Clipper, which is like a D-Bass compiler.
What do you think of digital recording and things like Pro Tools and...
You know, when I was in college in 1969, I was studying computers in medical school. Mm-hmm. They had this College of Health-Related Professions, and they knew that computers would help a great deal in organizing data and statistics and things like that. And I was one of 4 people in the class. You know, and it was such a small department that we had our room and the teachers would rotate. We didn't go to other classrooms. So it was really intimate. And these teachers, they were all involved in research. And they were, you know, the computers and things like that. One day I walked in and they had this 2-foot cube. It was like 2 feet on a side. It was an actual cube, and on the face of it was all of these, you know, electrical diagrams and holes for, you know, for plugs. And I said to one of the teachers, I said, "What is that?" He said, "Oh, that's an analog computer." I said, "Analog computers? What are you doing with that?" He says, "Well, you know, when you want to find the area under a curve on a digital computer, you have to divide it into little tiny rectangles and then add them all up. And the smaller the rectangles, the closer you get to the real number. Mm-hmm. But with this, you just add the voltages and you know exactly what the area under the curve is." "Oh, well, that's convenient." He says, "Yeah, but we're working on an analog to digital converter because we can't use the data unless we can get it into digital form." And I thought about that, and I says, "Analog to digital." I says, "You know, you could make a tape recorder that can record music with no tape hiss." And he thought about it. He says, "You know, you could." So I invented the digital tape machine, but I never produced one. And it was like 2-3 years later that they started talking about it.
Did you ever think that it would get this sophisticated when you were in 1969 when you were working with computers, that the world would be where it is now?
No, because the speed of the computers was so limited, you couldn't process that much. That I mean, the things that you do every day on that iPhone would have taken weeks and weeks just to show you what the list was for, you know, but they kept on making the chips faster and faster. And, you know, now they're talking about quantum computing and things that normally would take 20 years to process, to being able to do it in less than an hour. I haven't seen any of that yet, but...
What's coming?
Yeah.
What are you working on right now?
Well, I got a bunch of songs. I've been working on the lyrics and putting together a studio with some decent equipment where I can, you know, make some more records. And I plan on doing that, you know, since the music business has changed yet again.
Yep.
And nobody makes records anymore. You just put it on a streaming service.
Is that good or bad?
Well, it depends if you can make money.
Right.
And I know it's possible because since they started doing that, my royalties from Steely Dan has gone up, which is where I got the money to build the studio.
There you go. Well, I look forward to checking out your music that you gave me today, and I really appreciate you spending the time coming down here. It's really an honor to meet you.
Well, likewise. You know, I've enjoyed watching your other interviews.
Thanks for all the great music. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, you know, it's always interesting when you can make money on work that you've done 50 years ago.
Right. That's a good thing. Thank you, Denny. Appreciate it.